and welcome to Books Are Good Medicine. This podcast is sponsored by the Shakopee, Mdewakanton, and Sioux community and explores books and other Native American-focused teaching resources. We're your hosts, Odia Wood-Krueger
and Allison Waukau. Today we are talking about Native American terminology, covering some of the most commonly used terms and phrases.
We'll also cover which terms should be used or avoided in the classroom. We hope this episode is helpful and answers some questions for you. Hi, Allison.
Hi, Odia.
I am so excited about this episode. As a consultant doing work in this all the time, one of the things, probably the first question I always get is people are like, oh, but what is the term that I use? I'm really worried about offending someone. And while I understand that, it often sometimes sort of seems like it could be a trapdoor where teachers are like, oh, I don't want to offend, so I'm just not going to try.
Yes.
And I think this is a really great opportunity to sort of say to people like, chill out. It's okay. You don't have to have all the answers. And then we can just give them some tips and tricks about sort of how to navigate and jump over that trapdoor, assuming they want to.
Yeah, I think it's an easy excuse. And the same goes for, I think, library staff as well. They really want to follow the rules and the regulations. And so I think when this is not a clearly defined answer, and it's hard for folks when it's kind of ambiguous and like, what is it? And it can range from different answers. It just depends, I think, on the situation and the environment. And but I don't think there's necessarily any wrong answer to this question or this. So today, talking about this, hopefully we have some clarification for folks. But what are your thoughts on what would you like to be called?
So I'm Métis from Saskatchewan, and when people ask like, "Oh, well, where are you from?" I know they mean, where are you from?
Yes.
Where is home?
Yes.
Not, hey, I live in Minneapolis.
Right.
Right. And so I think that's the first hint for people like, oh, where are you from? Or where are your people from? Like, that is a deeper question that people need to realize that it's, in fact, people are doing that sort of, they're doing an Indigenous background check. And so for me, First Nations is the term that is used. Of course, Métis, First Nations, Inuit. But when I'm in a group of people and I know there are fellow Canadians who are of Indigenous background, I will always say American or Native American, First Nations. I will deliberately include that as a way to be inclusive and to acknowledge their presence. So how do you, when you give a presentation, are you mindful in like when you know who's in the audience?
Okay. So I like that you brought up where are you from, because that was something that was in the back of my mind too for this conversation. When I first went to college, people were asking me like, where are you from? And I really hadn't ever needed to tell people, because people that I interacted with previously, like in high school, they all knew where I was from, right? It was just a given. Grew up with them. And so going to college, this was the first time I really had the question of where are you from? And quickly realized it wasn't Albuquerque or, it was like, where is your homeland? And I think that is how people really like to be acknowledged, and it's just a respectful way. When giving presentations, I do like to be inclusive of folks that I know that are in the audience, but really, I think that it's kind of our way of being a detective, really, and sort of seeing, like, if you were to ask a non-native, oh, where are you from? They're going to be, oh, St. Paul, and then but Really, I think that it's important when doing this to do the tribes, the person's actual tribe. I think that's really important.
I think what we need to say to folks is ask people how they want to be referred to. Because a lot of people are like, oh, I don't want to, get too personal. And people won't be upset when you say, oh, where are you from? Or how do I address you? Or how do I reference your tribal community? People generally aren't upset about that.
No, I've never heard of anybody being upset about that. But I think the question too is in text. Like, how am I writing it in documents? How am I writing it in homework lessons and my curriculum and so forth? And I think that's where it kind of it really is a more difficult conversation, because I don't really hear folks saying, oh, Odia, are you Native American? Like, I don't, it's more like, oh, are you Native? But it's when it's in text that it's different. And you have to think about Native American, American Indian, Indigenous. And then 10 years ago, it would have been really highly regulated where you just used one throughout the whole document. Yeah. And now it's becoming where you can kind of use them interchangeably. And so I've seen that in some documents too, where it's not where you have to pick one for the whole thing. But I think it is hard in text to choose one. And I think for Indigenous too, I have seen where Indigenous is lowercase, the I is lowercase, and you have to capitalize that. I've always been really big on especially when you're talking about when you're relating it to actual folks that you are in relationship with. Go ahead.
I do want to bring up the style guide.
Yep.
So Native Governance Center, awesome, Native nonprofit here in the Midwest region. They've created this style guide, which very much says why we want to capitalize the I. So this is a great example that people can download. It's available for free. We'll put the link, make it available for folks. But that way it's, people have spent time thinking about this so that you don't have to. Right. And for people who don't necessarily, they have questions about the right way to do it, this is a great tool for people to use. And so thank you to the Native Governance Center for creating that. And it was, last updated in, 2021. But, things, they keep an eye on it, right? They care for it and they nurture it and make sure that it is up to date. So that's great.
I love the Native Governance Center. They're a really great tool. They do awesome things. And it's nice that it's right here in our backyard.
We are very fortunate.
Yeah. Tell me what else you have on your pile there. What other resources?
Yeah, so I have a second one by the Native Governance Center. This is How to Talk About Native Nations, a guide. And also, this one is 4 pages, fantastic. And it has some tips right on the front that I really, really love. Terminology is ever changing. Yes. Right? So you may be right now, but you might not be right in the future. And maybe the term you're using wasn't one that was used in the past. So I think I want to, sort of absolve people from feeling like they have to get the perfect term because we're going to be able to use and adapt. And it's fun to see, you and I, we're in our 40s, but you see the youth, right? And they adopt other terms that they want.
Yes.
And a lot of older Native people will still use the term Indian.
Right.
Right? Which really gets the hackles up for younger people. They're like, Indian? Oof, that's a terrible term. But I worked for Minneapolis Public Schools Indian Education Department for 9 years. And this is a term that is still readily used. It's still a government used term, Bureau of Indian Affairs. And in conversation with folks, they say if we make a stink about the word Indian and the government's like, cool, we'll change it, but can we change some other things in the process? So a lot of folks are reticent to, make a fight about Indian. And is that the ditch we want to die in kind of thing when there's so many other issues that we need to tackle outside of the term Indian? But that's just me.
Well, I think I once saw a recording of Russell Means, and he was talking, and don't quote me on this, but he was talking about how we simply need to claim that as our own. And he was, I'm trying to remember it, but it was really about how we can define it for ourselves and making Indian. If I'm right, he didn't like the American part, but he was just like, the Indian part is true in the context of what we have created and what it means to us now. And so my folks' generation do say Indian, and they say it with pride. It was something that my mom's generation really identified with, the American Indian movement and so forth. And so I think that's one thing that you're bringing up, is that it can mean different things to different people, and it's always going to be this fluid kind of definition. But I think it really comes down to, how are you saying it? Are you saying it with respect, or are you saying it as a derogatory term? And so as long as you are being respectful in the way that you're saying it, and it comes through.
As book lovers, I think it gets really sort of dicey for us, because how Indian is used in like Little House on the Prairie, and I think it should be pretty clear to folks that we don't necessarily love that text,
right?
But the connotations around the use of the word Indian,
yes,
in that series of books is different than, say, Indian shoes, right? So like there are different connotation altogether, right? And so I don't want people to look through their personal libraries and be like, oh my gosh, said Indian, that's getting relegated to the do not use pile, because own voices stories, people who are from that nation, from that background, who are writing stories and using that term, obviously are using it in a different context. And in an appropriate way,
right?
Versus like some of these other, books that I wish would get relegated to the do not use shelf. So let's talk about Minnesota.
Yes,
Minnesota, Makoche. So we have 11 tribal communities here in Minnesota, 4 Dakota, 11 Ojibwe. Yet not necessarily as simple as that. So we have the 7 Ojibwe, but they also use the term Anishinaabe.
Yes.
Or Chippewa.
Chippewa, yeah.
In Canada, there's also Ojibwe with the AY, or just the A. So let's unpack that a little bit.
I feel like it's kind of along the same lines as for Indian and Chippewa. My mom says it in a tone that it's like Chippewa, like it's very. She uses that for Ojibwe, and so it really was what they used back in the 70s, during her educational era, and but now it goes along the same lines with the Sioux. I think it's more using when it's tied to the tribe's title in treaties or documents and so forth. But it really isn't, or my mom will say Ojibwa, and I just think it's it's her time, right? But now it's Ojibwe, and different ways of spelling that, and but I don't see here in Minnesota, Dakota and Ojibwe, they're as long as I feel that folks that live here should know the tribes that are within your state. And in doing that, it's Dakota and Ojibwe. And then, like, when you get into it, you're starting to read things and you say Chippewa and Sioux. So how do you feel, what would you say for those two, Odia, with Chippewa and Sioux?
So we have the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, right, that sort of overarches, umbrellas over some of the Ojibwe. Yep. So what folks have told me, so when I worked for MPS's Indian Education Department, working with elders, they said that Chippewa is a byproduct of saying Ojibwe, 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 Ojibwe. And you say it enough and it eventually sounds like Chippewa. So it was a mishearing of that term. So in conversation with Dr. Brenda Child at the University of Minnesota, she always says Ojibwe. Deanna Standing Cloud, for instance, says Anishinaabe. So you have different generations who have a term that they prefer. Yeah. And Anishinaabe translates to First People. But it also, again, one of those umbrella terms that includes Potawatomi, Odawa, and Anishinaabe. So it has a much, like a broader, beyond borders group of folks, right? Which speaks to the relationship of that term. Oh, yeah. And so what's interesting, though, as we look at Minnesota state standards, they will use Anishinaabe. And so it's kind of a little fun thing for teachers when I say, well, technically, that includes Potawatomi and Odawa. So your range of what you can use in a classroom just suddenly got just a little bit bigger. The circles widened.
I like that.
And so I like to give them that little tip because, like, braiding sweetgrass or braiding sweetgrass overall, written by Robin Wall Kimmerer, she's Potawatomi. So, like, technically, that fits in the state standards, which is a fun one because people love to use that book. And so I think Dakota and Sioux gets a little harder, especially when we consider, the history of this place and the concerted effort to remove people from it. So Dakota people are really working diligently to reclaim their language. Sioux, I'm told, is, the byproduct of a language that wasn't theirs. That was what someone else referred them to, which means snake. And so it's a derogatory term that ended up, befalling Dakota people. So what I find particularly interesting about that is sort of the reclamation of people's identity, how they say, oh, I'm Dakota. Ramona Keto Stately, she'll say that she's Bade Wakantua. So she says it more the traditional way. Yet this podcast is sponsored by the Metawakan Sioux, right? And so it's like people are figuring that out, and finding grace for people as they do that is really beautiful for me. I like to watch people do that. And so I hope no one is like, oh yeah, Allison and Odia, they're perfect. They know exactly we're going to follow them. Because it's very much like ask people what what jives with them and what resonates within them, I think is really important.
Yeah. I think it is just so respectful to do one's tribe. And I love hearing when people are referring to me as Menominee and Navajo, or and it brings a lens of how they are seeing me as because that's my identity, right? And that's who I am. And so when I think if we were to have a consensus between you and I about this, it would be mostly to find out what tribe they are from and use that. And here in, I think it was Minneapolis, Indian Ed, has over like 100 different tribes, right? And so some are Dakota and some are Ojibwe, but a lot aren't. And so
some are Menominee and Navajo.
Right. Métis, yeah. So it's when you're here, especially to American Indian, Native American, I feel aren't disrespectful. And then they throw in the Native, right? And I remember, gosh, this must have been like 20 years ago. Native was only if you were talking to another Native. And now non-Native people can say Native, right? And so it just was like this early slang, or however you want to phrase it. And now it's gotten to where I really like that. I feel like Native is short for Native American, short for Native to these lands, and it's just a different kind of pop from Indigenous. I like it. I like Native. If I was to choose something, just in conversation, right? But I think when you're doing text, it would be Native American, and federally, I think they use American Indian, so that's always in to see what the actual document is, or so forth. But
well, in thinking again about books, right?
Yeah.
Since this is what we're doing.
Yes.
I think this is a sort of a great example for teachers when they read something, and sort of a secret way to see whether or not the book is written by someone who's actually identifies as Native. Mm-hmm. So are they, in the book, is the character simply the blanket term, they're Native American, right? Because identity is so important and place is so important to Indigenous people, you don't ever say like, hello, I'm Native American. Like you just don't do that.
No.
And so as we read books, and someone is just like very broad strokes, very pan-Indian, shall we say, about like this person's experience as a generic Native person.
Question.
Bet you $20 that book wasn't written by someone who identifies as Native.
Right.
And so you can sort of, once you start seeing those things or understanding those, you'll be like, oh yeah, they're writing about a Native experience they don't understand.
Right.
So I have a fun question for you that's not on here.
Ooh.
What is the appropriate term to call non-Native people?
Oh, my goodness. Well, I would hope that we could call them allies, but gosh, I always just use non-Native.
Right? Non-Native's common. I've seen settlers a lot. Like, settlers. But I've also seen colonizers.
Yeah.
Which I feel like has a harsher edge, but it isn't wrong.
Yes.
Like, I would actually love for some comments from people who, like, identify as Native and say, like, oh, this is what I would love for the interaction with people. But I'd also love to hear from some non-Native folks and be like, has anyone called you a colonizer, right? And what, does that bring up feelings? Or when someone calls you a settler, what feelings do you need to unpack there?
Well, I also have heard settler descendant. And
interesting.
That one, I just have all the feels, I think. You're talking about what non-Native folks would like to be called too, or like how, but even when I've heard some white folks say settler descendant, and I don't know, I feel like, yes, you're a descendant of someone that came here, but at the same time, you are still here. And so it just kind of plays with my mind a little bit. Yep. And so because you're still a settler, I would think, and so it really is, it's super, but I think that identities are just so in flux and being hashed out, and people are coming to terms with it themselves. I think the time that we're in is things, like even 10 years ago, were being defined for us, right? People were telling us what we were. And now we've come into an era where we're figuring it out for ourselves. And we are, understanding, coming to terms with our own identities and with our own tribes and nations. And I think it's just such a great time because I think even my kiddos say, "Oh, I'm Indian," and but they are. It brings me such pride to have them be able to say that and know that, because when I was growing up, it wasn't necessarily something you said, and now they're saying it with pride. And so I think we need to bring that forward. I think the conversation, it gets brought down with like we need a definition, and I think people come with wanting to right or wrong, black and white, and like all this, like we can't do a gray area. Gray is a beautiful color. Like, let's embrace it. And so I think as long as people come with respect and just being coming with wanting to know, with open curiosity, and there's no wrong way to approach this subject, right, or these terms. I'm glad that people are asking and wanting to identify people correctly. Teachers, library staff, and so forth. Just as long as you are not intentionally being disrespectful, I think that would be our answer for today, right? Like, just making sure that whatever term you are choosing, you are asking the person or the community that you're talking about, what is it that you would prefer us to use? And the default would always be the actual tribe, right? Always say Upper Sioux, or with their actual tribal name if you're writing it down, right? And so, but asking folks, that's all you got to do. That's all you got to do.
So a couple things came up for me in listening to you. One is here in Minnesota, there are Ojibwe and Dakota terms for white people.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Chimukaman.
Yep.
Or the slang Chimuks.
Yep.
Right? And then Wasichus for Dakota. And I think it'd be really fun to have folks come on and talk about that. And I think there are maybe some, connotations about that. I think about my good friends in New Zealand. He's Maori. His wife is Pakeha, or white. It is not a derogatory term. People say like, "Oh, I'm Pakeha." So, people can use that term. It is a common identifier over there. And I think here we're worried about a lot of like, oh, am I appropriating, or, is that term derogatory? So I think it'd be really fun to have James Vukolich perhaps, or Ramona Keto Stately, both of them talk about those terms and sort of unpack the deeper meanings behind those words. Because this isn't simply just white person or someone who's different. The other thing that stuck out for me was when you were talking about settler descendant. And I think descendant is sort of a word maybe that we need to unpack.
Sure. Yeah.
Do you want to, there are plenty of tribal members who are descendants.
Right.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
It's so descendant, I see it as is someone that is just not enough blood quantum, right? Why am I doing that? I don't know.
Blood. I think that is a great use of the air quotes.
But blood quantum to not be enrolled. Some tribes do honor and enroll their descendants in a way, but descendant is used as someone that I would say is still a member if they choose to be of a tribe. It's just that they're not enough by their tribal standards to be enrolled.
And I think it's tough. Like I think of in the guide to reliable ELA resources that we've mentioned in the past that's on the Understand Native Minnesota campaign page. I had a descendant reach out to me and be like, oh my gosh, like you said, I was from here, but you didn't say I was descendant. And they were concerned that maybe there would be blowback from tribal members because they're not enough. But then on the other side, there's some, and so you get this weird identity politics.
Yes.
And I think that we're getting a lot of folks who don't maybe are confused about what am I allowed to call myself. And I want folks to know to be gentle because I know a lot of our students too. They may be a byproduct of boarding schools or the 60s scoop in Canada where their relatives don't know where they are, and there's some shame related to that.
Oh, geez. Descendants, I have such a hard time. I have a good friend that is from Grand Portage, and I see her. She's technically a descendant, but she is Native. She is Ojibwe. And I don't see her as a descendant. I think it's how the way she carries herself and is and lives her life is sometimes even I don't choose to see people as descendants unless they're just not interacting with the tribe on any sort of level, right? If they're, but she definitely is, and it's so she sees herself as a descendant, but I don't see her as, and it's really hard, I think, and I would not, this is such a sticky, we're getting, and all the thoughts, but I would see our traditional values and our ancestors saying that they are ours and we have to claim them and we have to honor them. And so it makes me sad that someone says that they couldn't, be from that tribe and be honored like that. And they want the descendant added on. I think that it just makes me hurt a little bit because that's more of what the colonizer did want for us, and we're engaging in that. And so that's a whole nother conversation, I think, Odia.
Whole other episode,
yes,
right?
It totally
Talking about
is.
blood quantum.
Yeah, because there are so many things that are out there for blood quantum wise, and I've had friends in college that were 100% Native, but she was so little for blood quantum wise, could not enroll in any of her tribes. But she was a mix of so many, but she was Native, and it's just, it's something that we have to come to terms, like we really have to start figuring it out because blood quantum is really
it was a
successful.
Tool, right?
Yep,
it was a tool for exterminating Native folks. So just whittling it down, piecing it out. Yeah. And listening to you, I'm thinking about just a lovely elder from Fond du Lac, Holly Pellerin. She and I were talking at one of the Understand Native Minnesota Educator Academies, and she goes, Odia, it's like being pregnant. You're either pregnant or you're not. You're not kind of pregnant. Yeah. You're kind of not pregnant. It's either one or the other. Yeah, and so the elders get it. Yeah. Right? And maybe that comes with wisdom. But when you're stuck in this system that really wants to put people into boxes,
right.
It gets really hard and you start to question, am I enough? Mm-hmm. And then for those who've fought so much to be federally recognized, they're also like, we need people to fit within this box. So they're upholding, this colonial need to be enough. Yeah. And so it's complex.
It is. That's a good word, complex.
So I think we have not solved anything today. I hope we've given people some things to think about. One last resource I want to share is
yes, this is good.
Everything you wanted to know about Indians but were afraid to ask. So Anton Troyer has this awesome book. The cover, so great.
I know, it's
the beaded cover. This is the youth adaptation of his original book. And so Shakopee, Metawakan, and Sioux, through Understand Native Minnesota, did a book giveaway. And Holy Hannah, 10,000 copies, disappeared in under 30 minutes, which is pretty awesome.
It is.
And
love
so as part of that, though, several educator guides were created that pull from content. And this particular one is using appropriate American Indian terminology. It's created by Anjanette Parisian, Turtle Mountain Band of Ojibwe, or Band of Chippewa. Excuse me. Labels matter. And so all of these resources are available for free, of which there are several. But this one, particularly to do with terminology, I want to make sure people know. We'll also link to that one down below. And so, yeah, there are some good things for people who want it. So my number one is, please don't use it as a trapdoor. Please don't be scared. Please engage in conversation.
Yeah.
Native people aren't scary.
For the most part, yeah. I do know
except some of those elders. Watch out. Woo! So, Allison, thanks for digging into all the hard things today.
Yeah, thanks, Odia. I think there's more to come on this. I think there's more to come, and please leave your comments and questions, and we would really like to hear from you, and we'll probably dive a little bit deeper in this conversation.
You bet.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Books Are Good Medicine. Subscribe to our channel on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also visit our website, booksaregoodmedicine.com, to find episodes and resources, or to send us a comment. This podcast is sponsored by the Shakopee, Metawakan, and Sioux community and produced by Goff Public. Our theme song is Stomp Dance by Blue Dog. The opinions expressed on the Books Are Good Medicine podcast by its co-hosts and guests are their own in their personal capacities and do not necessarily reflect the views of any organization with whom they are affiliated or with the podcast's sponsor.